When an empath ceases the relentless cycle of people-pleasing, a profound shift begins, not just externally, but deep within the nervous system. This is not merely a behavioral change, it is a reclamation of self that challenges the familiar patterns learned in childhood, patterns that were shaped by survival in emotionally unpredictable environments. The empath, who has long prioritized others' comfort over their own, now confronts the quiet tension of asserting boundaries, of saying no, and of allowing discomfort to exist without immediately resolving it. In these moments, the empath is confronted with raw emotions, both their own and those reflected back from others. This shift can feel destabilizing because it pierces through the old coping mechanisms, the habitual giving of energy, the constant attunement to the emotional states of those around them, the compulsion to maintain harmony at the expense of personal truth. Yet, it is precisely within this discomfort that growth begins. The act of stopping the pleasing is not an act of rebellion or selfishness, it is an act of deep self-recognition. It is the acknowledgement that one's needs, feelings, and presence are not only valid, but essential. For the empath who has long been immersed in the emotional currents of others, this moment can trigger fear, guilt, and doubt. There is often an internal dialogue that questions whether withholding automatic care, attention, or approval will lead to loss of love, abandonment, or rejection. These are echoes from early attachment wounds, where love was conditional on conformity, compliance, and the soothing of others. As they step into non-pleasing, the empath begins to experience resistance externally as well. Relationships may shift, dynamics may tense, and previously comfortable connections can become uncertain. Yet it is in these shifts that clarity emerges. By no longer being the emotional caretaker at all costs, empaths can observe the authenticity of their relationships, who values them for their true selves, and who only valued the energy and affirmation they provided. It is also a moment of deep somatic realization as the body begins to respond to the absence of habitual self-sacrifice. Tension, anxiety, and even physical symptoms may arise as the nervous system recalibrates, learning to hold presence for itself rather than constantly attuning to others. The empath may feel a sense of emptiness at first, a disquiet that comes from stepping out of habitual codependency. But in that space, something else begins to grow: self-compassion, resilience, and a renewed capacity to experience their own emotions fully, without the overlay of constant external validation. Stopping the pleasing is also a confrontation with social expectations and internalized cultural narratives that equate value with selflessness, compliance, and caregiving. For many empaths, these narratives are deeply ingrained, and stepping away from them can trigger profound existential questioning. Yet it is precisely here, within the tension between old conditioning and new choices, that transformation occurs. The empath starts to discover a rhythm of life that honors both connection and individuality, empathy and autonomy. Boundaries once felt as uncomfortable or selfish begin to feel like an anchor, a stabilizing force that allows authentic engagement with the world rather than reactive involvement. The nervous system, over time, learns to tolerate the discomfort of being present for oneself without being swept into the emotional storms of others. And as this inner capacity strengthens, the empath becomes more effective in relationships, not less. Their energy is no longer diffused in compulsive caretaking, but focused in intentional, conscious engagement. They begin to witness the true reciprocity in connection, understanding that authentic love and respect are not contingent on constant self-erasure. This journey, though challenging, is profoundly liberating. It represents a fundamental reclamation of self, a deepening of emotional intelligence, and a path towards sustainable presence. The empath who stops pleasing is not abandoning empathy. They are refining it, integrating it with self-awareness, self-respect, and groundedness in the body and mind. Childhood attachment wounds often drive lifelong people-pleasing patterns, and this is particularly true for empaths who grow up in emotionally unpredictable or conditional environments. From a very young age, the empath learns that love, safety, and attention are contingent. They are not freely given, but must be earned through compliance, accommodation, or caretaking. These early experiences program the nervous system in ways that persist into adulthood, creating patterns of hyper-vigilance to others' emotions and needs. The child, sensitive to the emotional climate, learns to anticipate the moods, reactions, and desires of caregivers, often at the expense of their own developing sense of self. When a parent is emotionally unavailable, inconsistent, or volatile, the empath develops an adaptive strategy: please, appease, and anticipate, in order to secure the connection that is essential for survival. This is not a conscious choice. It is an instinctual response embedded in the body and nervous system. The empath's nervous system becomes finely tuned to detect tension, disappointment, or anger, and over time, this tuning becomes habitual. It creates an internal architecture where the self is defined by its responsiveness to others. The boundaries between one's own feelings and the feelings of others are blurred, and a sense of personal autonomy is replaced by a constant monitoring system, scanning for cues that might trigger disapproval or withdrawal. These attachment wounds also shape beliefs about worthiness. The empath may internalize the message that they are only valuable if they are useful, accommodating, or pleasing. This creates a deep-seated drive to maintain harmony and avoid conflict, because conflict is experienced not just as disagreement, but as a threat to survival. Over time, these beliefs and behaviors solidify into patterns that feel automatic and necessary. Even when the empath is conscious of the dynamics, stopping the pleasing can evoke intense anxiety, fear, or shame, because it challenges the very strategies that once ensured safety and connection. The wounds themselves are often invisible, leaving the empath with a persistent sense of inadequacy or self-doubt, even as they successfully care for others. These patterns are compounded by the body's somatic memory. The nervous system remembers the stress of unmet needs, rejection, or conditional love, storing it in muscular tension, visceral sensations, and chronic anxiety. When the empath engages in people pleasing as an adult, it is not merely a behavioral habit, but a physiological one. Their body anticipates the need to soothe, accommodate, or overextend, and it mobilizes energy accordingly. Even subtle acts of resistance or self-assertion can trigger a cascade of stress responses: increased heart rate, shallow breathing, tension in the chest and shoulders, or an underlying sense of dread. Understanding these patterns through the lens of attachment allows the empath to see that their people pleasing is not a character flaw or moral failing, but an adaptive response that once served a survival function. It reframes the struggle as a form of resilience and attunement gone awry, rather than weakness or selfishness. Healing these attachment wounds requires awareness of both the internalized beliefs and the somatic imprint. It involves recognizing when behaviors are driven by unconscious survival strategies rather than conscious choice. For many empaths, the first step is learning to tolerate discomfort, the discomfort of saying no, of asserting needs, or of facing another's disappointment, without automatically collapsing into old patterns. This requires a compassionate stance toward oneself, acknowledging the depth of the adaptation without judgment. In addition, it involves creating a relational environment that allows for authenticity and reciprocity, where boundaries are respected and needs are met in ways that reinforce rather than undermine the sense of self. The work of addressing attachment wounds is ongoing and iterative. Old triggers will arise repeatedly, and the nervous system will resist change, sometimes through intense emotional or physical reactions. The empath may encounter guilt, fear of abandonment, or the sense of being unlovable, all echoes of early experiences. Yet, with awareness and practice, new patterns of connection and self-regulation can emerge. The empath learns to distinguish between genuine attunement and compulsive pleasing, cultivating the ability to respond rather than react. This process deepens self-understanding, emotional resilience, and relational authenticity. Over time, the empath begins to reclaim the self that was deferred or suppressed in childhood, integrating sensitivity with autonomy and care with boundaries, and learning that their worth is inherent rather than conditional. Saying no awakens fear, guilt, and the sense of potential rejection, and for the empath, this is a seismic shift that touches both the mind and the nervous system. For much of their life, the empath has equated their value with their capacity to accommodate, soothe, and anticipate the needs of others. The act of saying no is therefore experienced, not simply as a refusal of a request, but as a potential threat to relational survival. The fear that emerges is deeply primal. It is the echo of early experiences in which love, attention, or approval felt conditional, and the slightest misstep could provoke withdrawal or disappointment. Saying no disrupts the habitual patterns that once guaranteed emotional safety, forcing the empath into uncharted territory where the automatic strategies of caretaking and appeasement are intentionally suspended. Alongside fear, guilt rises, an emotional feedback loop that has been internalized from early attachment dynamics. The empath may feel a sharp internal critique, a whisper or clamor that suggests selfishness, unkindness, or failure. This guilt is not merely cognitive, it is somatic, felt in the tightening of the chest, the sinking of the stomach, and a sense of tension in the spine and shoulders. It is the body remembering that, in the past, Withdrawal of care might have had consequences, and it instinctively interprets the act of saying no as a transgression. The sense of potential rejection is also immediate and visceral. Empaths are acutely sensitive to the reactions of others, and even the subtle hints of disappointment, irritation, or distance can trigger alarm. The nervous system, having been conditioned to anticipate relational threat, activates fight, flight, or freeze responses. The empath may feel a sudden rush of anxiety, a pounding heartbeat, or an overwhelming urge to justify, explain, or retract the refusal. Yet, it is precisely within this discomfort that growth and liberation are possible. By consciously allowing themselves to say no, empaths confront the internalized belief that love and approval are contingent on compliance. They begin to discover that boundaries, while initially unsettling, do not automatically destroy relationships but instead create space for authenticity. This process is rarely linear. Early attempts to say no may feel awkward, provoke tension in others, or even trigger conflict. The empath may experience heightened sensitivity to criticism, heightened empathy for the other's disappointment, or an internal debate that seeks to revert to old patterns. The fear and guilt, however, gradually become indicators of growth rather than evidence of wrongdoing. Each act of refusal that is met without catastrophic consequences teaches the nervous system that autonomy is not synonymous with abandonment. The empath begins to notice subtle shifts. Their own energy stabilizes when they stop overextending, and relationships evolve toward mutual respect rather than transactional compliance. Saying no also requires conscious self-awareness. The empath must learn to discern when a request aligns with their values and capacity versus when it emerges from conditioned impulse to please. This discernment often demands pause, reflection, and an attunement to bodily signals, tightness, tension, or discomfort that signal automatic reflexive patterns. Through this awareness, the empath can distinguish between genuine willingness to help and compelled overgiving, allowing refusal to become an act of clarity and integrity rather than defiance or avoidance. As the empath continues to practice saying no, the nervous system slowly recalibrates. The alarm response triggered by potential conflict diminishes, and a new baseline of safety and self-possession emerges. Fear becomes a signal rather than a dictator, guilt transforms into reflective awareness, and the threat of rejection loses its paralyzing grip. Importantly, this shift is not about withdrawing from connection, but about engaging in relationships from a place of authenticity, rather than compulsion. The empath begins to recognize that their value is intrinsic, and that connection based on mutual respect and genuine regard is more sustaining than that which depends on constant appeasement. Over time, the act of saying no becomes a tool for self-regulation, emotional resilience, and authentic engagement. It redefines the empath's relationship with themselves and with the world, teaching that presence, care, and love are most potent when freely given, not coerced by fear or conditioned guilt. Each refusal, though small or seemingly inconsequential, carries profound lessons about the self, the body, and relational dynamics, and it gradually cultivates an internal authority that had long been ceded to external expectations. Authentic relationships are revealed when boundaries are enforced, and for the empath, this revelation can be both illuminating and unsettling. Throughout life, empaths often operate under the assumption that connection depends on constant accommodation, responsiveness, and emotional labor. People-pleasing has been a strategy to secure love, approval, and inclusion, and it often masks the true dynamics of the relationship. When the empath begins to enforce boundaries, this habitual pattern is disrupted, and the authenticity of each connection comes into sharper focus. Boundaries function as a mirror, reflecting back the nature of the relationship in ways that had previously been obscured. Some relationships, once felt as safe and stable, reveal themselves to be contingent, transactional, or conditional, based on the empath's willingness to give, adapt, or suppress their own needs. The moment a boundary is asserted, reactions from others can range from discomfort to resistance, irritation, or even withdrawal. These responses are not inherently bad, but they serve as indicators of the underlying relational health. For the empath, who has long internalized the responsibility for others' emotional states, such reactions can trigger anxiety, doubt, and fear. Yet, these feelings are an essential part of the process. The enforcement of boundaries does not only test the strength of a connection, it also provides a necessary contrast between relationships that are supportive and those that are draining. Empaths begin to notice who respects their limits, honors their autonomy, and responds with empathy rather than resentment. These relationships tend to deepen because the connection is no longer predicated on obligation or self-sacrifice but on mutual recognition and genuine care. Conversely, relationships that cannot accommodate boundaries begin to show strain, sometimes leading to conflict or distancing. This is a natural and healthy consequence of reclaiming selfhood, and it often challenges the empath's internalized fears of abandonment. Over time, enforcing boundaries cultivates discernment and clarity. The empath learns to distinguish between connections that are reciprocal and those that are extractive. They recognize that relationships rooted in conditional acceptance or dependency are unsustainable and often reinforce old patterns of self-neglect. In contrast, relationships that respect autonomy and encourage authenticity become nourishing and stabilizing. The process is not merely cognitive, it is deeply somatic. The body responds to the enforcement of boundaries with a complex interplay of tension, release, and recalibration. Initial attempts may provoke stress, discomfort, or a sense of vulnerability as the nervous system adjusts to the absence of habitual caretaking. Over time, the body learns to inhabit space without constantly anticipating the needs of others, cultivating a grounded presence that is centered and resilient. This embodiment enhances relational authenticity, as the empath can engage from a place of wholeness rather than depletion. Enforcing boundaries also transforms the empath's perception of responsibility. Previously, they may have carried the burden of others' emotional experiences, interpreting reactions as reflections of their own value or failure. Through boundary setting, they begin to recognize that each individual is responsible for their own feelings, and that healthy connection is a collaboration rather than a one-sided effort. This insight reduces the compulsion to overgive and fosters more sustainable, balanced relationships. As authenticity emerges, the empath experiences the paradoxical freedom that comes from saying no. The fear of rejection may surface, yet the relationships that endure become more genuine and nourishing. Emotional clarity increases, because interactions are no longer filtered through the lens of anxiety, guilt, or compulsion. The empath begins to witness the true reciprocity of love, attention, and care, and they recognize that connection does not require self-erasure. Over time, this process rewires relational patterns, creating a foundation of trust, respect, and emotional integrity. The empath learns that enforcing boundaries is not an act of separation but an act of alignment with one's own values and needs. It strengthens self-trust, cultivates self-compassion, and fosters an inner authority that allows for presence without overextension. Each act of boundary enforcement, no matter how small, becomes a building block for emotional resilience, relational clarity, and authentic connection. The empath comes to understand that relationships are not tested by perpetual self-sacrifice, but by the capacity to engage fully, honestly, and respectfully, while honoring both self and other physical and emotional discomfort emerges as the body adjusts to self-presence. And for empaths, this can be a profound and sometimes disorienting experience. For years, their nervous system has operated in a heightened state of vigilance, finely attuned to the emotional currents of others. Every sigh, facial expression, or shift in tone was registered as a signal requiring immediate response. Over time, this constant attunement became a default mode, shaping not only behavior but the body itself, manifesting as muscular tension, chronic fatigue, gastrointestinal disturbances, or unexplained aches and pains. When the empath stops pleasing, ceases the habitual caretaking, and begins to prioritize self-boundaries, the body is suddenly confronted with unfamiliar sensations. Without the usual pattern of accommodating and soothing others, the nervous system must recalibrate. Initial responses often include anxiety, restlessness, irritability, or an unsettling sense of emptiness. These reactions are not signs of failure or weakness, but of the body's recognition that a long-established pattern has shifted. The autonomic nervous system, having been conditioned to anticipate relational threat and respond with hypervigilance, temporarily struggles to find equilibrium. The empath may notice tightness in the chest, shallow or irregular breathing, tension in the shoulders, or a gnawing pit of unease in the stomach. Emotionally, the discomfort can manifest as guilt, fear, or heightened sensitivity to others' reactions. Every act of asserting boundaries or saying no may trigger a cascade of physiological and emotional signals, reminding the empath of old survival strategies and conditioning. Yet it is precisely within this discomfort that healing and integration can occur. The body, when allowed to inhabit its sensations without immediate reflexive action, begins to teach new patterns of presence, self-awareness, and emotional regulation. For instance, the initial anxiety or tightness that arises when declining a request can, over time, become an opportunity to practice grounding, breath awareness, or somatic self-soothing. These practices help the nervous system learn that discomfort does not necessarily signal danger, and that presence with one's own feelings is safe. This recalibration also reveals the subtle ways in which empathic overextension has shaped physical health. Chronic fatigue, tension, headaches, or digestive issues may have been partially rooted in the relentless demand to accommodate others' needs at the expense of one's own. As self-boundaries strengthen and energy is conserved, the body gradually experiences relief, increased vitality, and a sense of internal spaciousness. Emotional discomfort, too, begins to transform. The empath learns that feelings of guilt, anxiety, or fear are not inherently indicators of wrongdoing, but are echoes of conditioning and early attachment patterns. By observing these sensations with curiosity and compassion, rather than reacting automatically, the empath cultivates emotional resilience. This embodied awareness creates a feedback loop. As the nervous system learns to tolerate the discomfort of self-presence, the empath becomes more capable of authentic engagement with both themselves and others. The body's recalibration also enhances decision-making and relational discernment. With less reactive energy being consumed by habitual caretaking, the empath can attend more fully to their own needs, desires, and limits. This presence strengthens clarity, allowing choices to emerge from conscious alignment rather than reflexive obligation. Over time, physical and emotional discomfort diminishes, not because the challenges disappear, but because the nervous system develops the capacity to contain them without being hijacked. This shift fosters a profound sense of empowerment, as the empath discovers that they can inhabit their own body, emotions, and boundaries without immediate defensive action. The recalibration process is not linear. Periods of discomfort may recur, triggered by familiar relational dynamics, unexpected demands, or internalized fears of rejection. Yet each recurrence is an opportunity for deeper integration, reinforcing the nervous system's ability to tolerate presence with oneself, maintain boundaries, and engage authentically with the world. Through this process, the empath learns a fundamental truth: discomfort is not a sign of failure, but a guide pointing toward areas of growth, self-recognition, and liberation. The body, long trained to anticipate the needs of others, becomes a partner in self-awareness, teaching patience, attunement to one's own signals, and the profound value of presence with oneself. The recalibration of both body and emotions lays the groundwork for sustainable empathy, authentic relationships, and a life lived from a place of integrity and self-possession. Social and cultural conditioning can conflict with the empath's newfound autonomy, and this tension is often one of the most subtle yet persistent challenges they face when they stop people-pleasing. From an early age, empaths are exposed to implicit and explicit messages about the roles they are expected to play, the behaviors deemed acceptable, and the ways in which care, attention, and self-sacrifice are valorized. These messages are reinforced by family, educational systems, religious institutions, and broader societal narratives that often equate goodness with compliance, kindness with self-erasure, and relational harmony with personal suppression. For an empath who has internalized these cultural norms, stepping away from habitual pleasing can feel almost heretical, as though they are defying a fundamental rule of moral and social order. The conflict arises because the nervous system carries the echoes of these internalized messages, creating discomfort, guilt, and anxiety whenever the empath asserts boundaries or prioritizes their own needs. This internalized cultural conditioning is often reinforced externally. Friends, family, colleagues, and social networks may unconsciously or consciously respond to the empath's shift with confusion, criticism, or resistance. A simple refusal, a boundary, or an honest declaration of need can trigger subtle pressure to revert to previous patterns, reminding the empath that deviation from social expectations is not without consequence. The empath may encounter comments framed as concern or advice. "You're being selfish. You need to think of others. Why are you being so difficult?" which can stir old guilt loops and challenge newly formed boundaries. Over time, these pressures can provoke self-doubt, anxiety, or even withdrawal from authentic expression. The empath may question whether their assertion of autonomy is justified or whether they are somehow failing to meet the implicit requirements of being good, loving, or acceptable in society. This is where awareness and reflection become essential. Understanding the origins of these social and cultural expectations allows the empath to discern between constructive guidance and conditioning that no longer serves their well-being. It becomes a practice of internal discernment, weighing the external pressures against personal integrity and emotional health. The empath learns to recognize the subtle ways in which culture has shaped their patterns of self-neglect, and to differentiate between adaptive social engagement and compulsive compliance. Cultural conditioning can also manifest as internalized perfectionism or hyper-responsibility. The empath may feel compelled to overachieve, overgive, or overmanage to maintain a sense of worthiness and acceptance. Stepping away from people pleasing threatens these internalized measures of success, provoking tension, discomfort, and anxiety. Yet it is precisely this tension that marks the potential for growth. By confronting the dissonance between external expectations and internal truth, the empath begins to develop autonomy not as a rejection of society, but as a reclamation of self within it. The process requires courage and patience. Cultural norms are reinforced over decades, and the empath's nervous system may resist change, triggering familiar patterns of anxiety, guilt, or self-blame. Progress often occurs incrementally, setting small boundaries, practicing self-compassion, and gradually testing the waters of autonomy in relational contexts. Over time, the empath discovers that social and cultural expectations, while influential, are not absolute determinants of self-worth or relational connection. Authenticity can coexist with social engagement, and boundaries can be maintained without abandoning empathy or connection. The empath begins to recognize that true influence and care are not the result of compulsive giving or conformity, but arise from conscious, intentional presence. The process of negotiating social and cultural conditioning also illuminates the broader dynamics of power, expectation, and relational energy. Empaths observe which relationships are sustainable when they operate from a place of authenticity, and which rely on habitual compliance or suppression. They learn to navigate social contexts with clarity, asserting autonomy while maintaining compassionate engagement. In doing so, they cultivate an inner authority that is resilient to external pressures, allowing them to participate in society without sacrificing their integrity, boundaries, or emotional health. Over time, the empath experiences the liberation of aligning internal truth with external action, breaking free from the subtle yet pervasive influence of conditioning, and learning that social participation and personal autonomy are not mutually exclusive. This alignment fosters emotional resilience, relational clarity, and a sense of empowerment that transforms not only the individual, but the quality of their interactions with the world around themselves. Compassion and resilience grow as habitual caretaking decreases, and for the empath, this process is both subtle and profound. When a lifetime of people pleasing is interrupted, the empath is confronted with a new relational and emotional landscape where their energy is no longer automatically consumed by the needs of others. This creates an initial void, a sense of discomfort, anxiety, or even guilt, as the patterns that once structured their life are loosened. Yet within this space lies the opportunity for deep self-recognition and growth. Self-compassion emerges as the empath begins to treat themselves with the same gentleness and care they have long extended to others. Previously, their energy and attention were invested in soothing, accommodating, and anticipating the feelings of those around them, often at the cost of their own emotional health. The act of stepping back is not a withdrawal from empathy, but an invitation to redirect it inward, to recognize the validity of one's own needs, emotions, and boundaries. This requires awareness of the automatic guilt or self-criticism that arises when they choose themselves over others. The empath may notice thoughts such as, "I should be helping," "I am letting them down," or "I am being selfish," which are echoes of early attachment experiences and societal conditioning. By observing these thoughts without judgment and responding with care, the empath cultivates a compassionate internal voice, one that validates their experience and recognizes that prioritizing self-preservation is not a moral failing, but a necessity for emotional health. Resilience grows hand in hand with this process. As the empath exercises boundaries and witnesses the natural consequences of reducing overextension, they gain confidence in their ability to navigate relational dynamics without sacrificing themselves. The nervous system, long conditioned to hyper-vigilance, slowly recalibrates, learning that asserting limits does not lead to catastrophic rejection or loss. Each act of self-prioritization reinforces the body's sense of safety, teaching that discomfort and fear can be tolerated without dissolving the self. This embodied resilience enhances the empath's capacity for authentic engagement. Freed from the compulsive need to please, they can participate in relationships with clarity, intentionality, and presence. Rather than reacting from patterns of anxiety or self-erasure, the empath begins to recognize that sustainable connection is not dependent on over-giving but on conscious, balanced reciprocity. The growth of self-compassion and resilience also reshapes emotional regulation. Previously, empaths might have experienced heightened stress responses, chronic tension, or somatic discomfort due to persistent overextension. By redirecting attention inward and setting healthy boundaries, the nervous system gradually finds equilibrium. Anxiety, guilt, and hyper-vigilance diminish in intensity as the empath experiences that they can maintain connection without constant self-sacrifice. This recalibration fosters not only internal stability, but also relational health, as interactions are no longer dominated by the unconscious need to appease or avoid conflict. The development of self-compassion and resilience is reinforced by reflective practices, such as journaling, meditation, breathwork, or somatic awareness. These practices allow the empath to observe habitual patterns, recognize triggers, and consciously respond rather than react. Over time, the empath internalizes a sense of agency, learning to navigate life from a position of strength and self-awareness rather than compulsion. Social interactions become less stressful, as the empath is no longer caught in the relentless loop of anticipating others' needs at the expense of their own. This internal authority is coupled with emotional intelligence, enabling the empath to engage in complex relational dynamics with clarity, empathy, and discernment. Importantly, self-compassion and resilience reinforce one another. As the empath treats themselves kindly and honors their needs, their capacity to tolerate discomfort, conflict, and relational ambiguity increases. Likewise, as they navigate challenges with courage and presence, their internal sense of worth and stability deepens, further nurturing self-compassion. The process is iterative and ongoing. Old patterns may resurface, and the nervous system may resist recalibration at times, triggering guilt, anxiety, or urges to revert to people-pleasing behaviors. Yet each conscious choice to maintain boundaries and practice self-care strengthens the empath's emotional and somatic resilience. Over time, these repeated acts of self-recognition and care cultivate a profound sense of empowerment, autonomy, and emotional stability. The empath learns that their capacity for love, connection, and empathy is enhanced, not diminished, when they honor their own needs and cultivate an inner reservoir of strength, compassion, and balance. Stopping pleasing enhances both emotional intelligence and relational authenticity, and for the empath, this transformation is subtle yet profound. When the habitual cycle of people-pleasing is interrupted, the empath is forced to engage with both their own emotions and those of others from a space of conscious awareness, rather than reflexive reaction. Emotional intelligence, in this context, does not simply refer to an ability to read others' feelings. It encompasses the capacity to recognize, tolerate, and respond to one's own emotional states while maintaining clarity and composure in relational dynamics. Previously, the empath's emotional intelligence was skewed outward. They became finely attuned to the emotional climate of those around them, often at the expense of awareness or regulation of their own inner states. Stopping the pleasing redirects attention inward, allowing the empath to notice triggers, automatic responses, and somatic signals that were once drowned out by the constant focus on others. This self-attunement strengthens emotional literacy, as the empath learns to distinguish between their own emotions and those projected or mirrored by others. They begin to recognize the difference between genuine empathy, an informed, intentional response, and reactive caretaking, which is driven by fear, guilt, or conditioned obligation. As this awareness deepens, the empath's capacity for relational authenticity grows. Relationships that were once maintained through compliance or over-giving are now approached from a foundation of presence, honesty, and boundaries. The empath engages with others not to elicit approval or avoid conflict, but to connect in ways that honor both parties' needs and autonomy. This shift has a clarifying effect. Interactions become more transparent, intentions are communicated more clearly, and reciprocity replaces one-sided effort. The empath learns that true connection is not about controlling or managing the emotions of others, but about holding space for them while remaining anchored in one's own experience. The nervous system plays a crucial role in this transformation. When the empath ceases habitual pleasing, initial anxiety, tension, or discomfort may arise, reflecting the body's memory of past attachment dynamics and conditioned patterns. Yet as they practice self-presence and boundary setting, the nervous system gradually recalibrates, learning that relational engagement does not require overextension or self-neglect. Emotional regulation improves, stress responses diminish, and the empath can maintain equanimity even in complex or challenging interactions. This physiological grounding enhances both cognitive clarity and emotional discernment, key components of emotional intelligence. Additionally, Relational authenticity is strengthened because the empath's interactions are no longer filtered through fear or compulsion. They begin to observe patterns, motivations, and the true dynamics of relationships with clarity. This awareness allows them to navigate social and intimate connections with integrity, choosing engagement based on alignment with personal values and mutual respect rather than obligation. Over time, stopping pleasing cultivates resilience in both the internal and relational spheres. The empath becomes capable of tolerating discomfort, asserting needs, and managing conflict without reactive overextension. They learn that boundaries do not alienate others but foster healthier, more sustainable connections. The interplay between self-awareness and relational insight deepens, enhancing the empath's ability to respond rather than react, to engage authentically rather than performatively, and to maintain balance between care for self and care for others. In this way, emotional intelligence and relational authenticity reinforce each other. As the empath grows more attuned to their internal state, they are better equipped to navigate external dynamics with empathy, clarity, and presence. Simultaneously, authentic relational engagement further cultivates self-knowledge, as interactions provide feedback and opportunities for conscious choice. The empath begins to recognize that true empathy is not synonymous with self-sacrifice. It is a capacity to engage deeply, respectfully, and intentionally while maintaining internal coherence and personal integrity. This integration transforms both the self and the relational landscape, fostering a life marked by authenticity, conscious presence, and balanced emotional responsiveness. The empath discovers that when they cease habitual pleasing, they do not lose connection, they gain it in its most genuine, sustainable, and meaningful form. Their emotional intelligence becomes nuanced and embodied, their relationships become more transparent and reciprocal, and their capacity to navigate life with integrity, clarity, and empathy expands profoundly, creating a foundation for continued growth, resilience, and authentic human connection.